The Battle of Monte Cassino, fought from January to May 1944, was one of the most intense battles of World War II. The Allies, aiming to break through German defenses in Italy and liberate Rome, faced fierce resistance from the Nazi forces occupying the city. After months of brutal fighting, the Allies emerged victorious, dealing a significant blow to the Germans. However, rather than being remembered solely for their military success, the battle became infamous due to the horrific violence inflicted upon Italian civilians, particularly women. In the aftermath of the battle, French colonial troops, primarily from Morocco, unleashed a wave of brutality against the local population. These soldiers, part of the French Expeditionary Corps, were given free rein by their commander, General Alphonse Juin, to do as they wished without fear of punishment. This lack of discipline led to widespread atrocities, including sexual assault, looting, and murder, which became known as the Moroccan Night. Instead of celebrating their liberation, many Italians found themselves subjected to an entirely different kind of terror. These atrocities overshadowed the military victory, leaving a permanent stain on the legacy of the battle. The violence inflicted upon the civilians of Monte Cassino and surrounding areas was a tragic reminder of the horrors that often accompany war. The innocent lives lost and the suffering endured by women and children continue to haunt the history of the conflict. The violence that followed the Battle of Monte Cassino was largely perpetrated by French colonial troops, particularly those from Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. These soldiers, part of the French Expeditionary Corps, had played a crucial role in breaking through German defenses during the battle. However, after their victory, they were given free rein by their commander, General Alphonse Juin, to act as they wished without fear of punishment. This lack of oversight led to a wave of brutality against Italian civilians. The soldiers, emboldened by their commander's lack of discipline, engaged in widespread sexual assault, looting, and killings. The civilians who had hoped for liberation found themselves facing a new kind of terror, as the brutality they experienced from their supposed liberators was unimaginable. The attacks were especially focused on women and children. Thousands of women were sexually assaulted and many civilians were killed. Entire villages were ravaged, and those who tried to resist were met with even more violence. The violence became so extreme that it was later dubbed the Moroccan Night, a horrific legacy of the battle. The aftermath of Monte Cassino, rather than bringing relief to the Italian people, marked the beginning of a new nightmare. The actions of these troops, unchecked by their superiors, left deep scars on the affected communities. The trauma endured by the survivors is still felt today. The atrocities committed by the French colonial troops were especially brutal due to their unchecked violence. Following the Battle of Monte Cassino, the soldiers, particularly those from Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, were given freedom by their commander, General Alphonse Juin, to do as they pleased. This lack of restraint led to horrific violence against the civilian population. The primary victims were women and children. The soldiers engaged in widespread sexual assaults, with many women being repeatedly raped and abused. The violence was not limited to sexual assault, as the troops also looted homes and murdered civilians. Many innocent lives were lost, and families were torn apart by the brutality of the attacks. Entire villages were affected, and the local population was forced to live in constant fear. Women and children were abducted and subjected to unimaginable horrors, while men who tried to defend them were often killed. The soldiers' violence was indiscriminate, affecting people of all ages, with no one safe from the attacks. These atrocities, which lasted for days, became known as the Moroccan Night. The lasting trauma inflicted on the survivors was immense, with many experiencing deep psychological scars that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The violence at Monte Cassino remains a dark chapter in history. Despite numerous testimonies and evidence from witnesses, the French government took no action to stop the atrocities committed by their soldiers. The perpetrators of these horrific crimes faced no consequences for their actions, and the military leadership failed to intervene or bring those responsible to justice. This lack of accountability left the victims without any form of reparation or closure. General Alphonse Juin, the French commander, had given his troops carte blanche to do as they pleased after the battle. His orders allowed the soldiers to engage in violent behavior without fear of punishment. This decision contributed directly to the scale of the violence and the lack of any deterrent. It was a decision that had devastating consequences for the local civilian population. The victims of the Moroccan Night were left to deal with the aftermath on their own. Many survivors tried to speak out, but their voices were ignored. The failure of the French military to take responsibility or even acknowledge the severity of the violence was a betrayal of those who had suffered. This silence compounded the trauma, leaving the victims feeling abandoned by those who were supposed to protect them. It wasn't until years later, in 2004, that a Moroccan Veterans Association issued a formal apology. However, the French government never acknowledged the crimes or offered compensation, leaving the survivors with no official recognition or justice for their suffering. The psychological and emotional consequences of the violence were devastating for the survivors. Many of the victims, particularly women, were left with deep emotional scars that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The trauma they experienced, from sexual assault to witnessing the brutal killings of their loved ones, created lasting psychological wounds. Many survivors struggled with feelings of shame, isolation, and fear. The trauma of the attacks led to long-term mental health issues such as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, anxiety, and depression. These psychological scars prevented many from leading normal lives, making it difficult for them to form relationships or integrate back into society. The social impact of the violence was equally severe. Victims, especially women, faced stigma and were often left feeling isolated. The psychological toll of the violence made it difficult for many survivors to speak about their experiences, leaving them with unresolved trauma. The lack of support and recognition further deepened their sense of abandonment. For many, the pain they endured was compounded by the lack of justice. The failure of the French government to acknowledge the atrocities left the survivors feeling forgotten. Without official recognition, many victims struggled to find closure, leaving their emotional wounds unhealed. The trauma they faced remained a permanent part of their lives. The lack of justice and recognition for the survivors of the Moroccan Night has left a lasting impact on their emotional well-being. Despite numerous accounts from witnesses and victims, no formal action was taken by the French government to hold the perpetrators accountable. This failure to address the atrocities has perpetuated a deep sense of injustice among the victims and their families. The survivors, left without support or acknowledgement, continue to carry the burden of their trauma. Many have lived with the pain and suffering of the violence they endured, and the absence of recognition only deepens their emotional wounds. The lack of an apology from the French government has left them feeling abandoned and forgotten, as their suffering has not been officially acknowledged. In the years following the atrocities, Some survivors and their descendants have fought for justice, seeking recognition of the crimes and reparations. However, despite their efforts, the French government has remained silent, offering no apology or compensation. This continued refusal to take responsibility has hindered the healing process for those affected. The struggle for justice continues to this day, with survivors and advocates pushing for acknowledgement and accountability. Until the French government recognizes the atrocities and provides reparations, the emotional wounds of the survivors will remain unhealed, and the injustice they faced will persist. The survivors of the Monte Cassino atrocities continue to live with the long-lasting effects of the violence they endured. The trauma they experienced has affected not only them but also their families and communities. Many survivors still struggle with the psychological scars left by the violence, which include anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. These emotional wounds often prevent them from leading normal lives or finding peace. The lack of justice and recognition for their suffering has only added to the trauma. The survivors were denied the closure and support they needed, and the failure of the French government to acknowledge the atrocities has made their healing even more difficult. They were left to carry the burden of their pain alone, with little hope for acknowledgement or reparations. As time passed, the survivors' stories began to fade from the public consciousness. Many victims have died without seeing any justice, and the silence surrounding the events of the Moroccan night has left a painful void. However, the descendants of the survivors continue to push for recognition and justice, determined to ensure that these atrocities are not forgotten. The ongoing fight for justice is not only about securing reparations for the victims, but also about preserving their stories and ensuring that future generations understand the full extent of the horrors they faced. The struggle for justice remains crucial to healing and preserving the memory of those who suffered. The continued struggle for justice reflects the deep emotional and psychological scars left by the atrocities of the Moroccan night. Survivors and their families remain committed to seeking recognition, an official apology, and reparations for the horrors they endured. This fight, however, is not just about receiving financial compensation, but about restoring their dignity and acknowledging the immense suffering they went through. The silence and lack of action from the French government have compounded the survivors' pain. Many feel that their suffering has been ignored by those in power. The absence of any formal recognition of the violence has left the survivors feeling abandoned and betrayed, unable to heal from the traumatic events that took place. Despite these obstacles, the survivors' descendants continue to advocate for justice. They strive to ensure that the atrocities are remembered and that the truth is acknowledged. Their fight is driven by a desire to bring closure to the painful legacy of the Moroccan night and to prevent future generations from forgetting these dark chapters of history. For many, this ongoing battle for justice is a way to honor the victims and preserve their stories. Until the French government takes responsibility for the crimes committed, the survivors' pain will continue and the wounds will remain open. Recognition and accountability are essential steps toward healing. The failure to address the atrocities of the Moroccan night has left a painful legacy. Survivors of the violence continue to suffer from the psychological and emotional consequences of the attacks, with many unable to fully recover. The lack of recognition and justice from the French government has only deepened their trauma, leaving them with feelings of abandonment and neglect. As time has passed, the stories of these atrocities have been largely erased from public memory. The survivors, many of whom are no longer alive, were left without justice or closure. The silence surrounding the events has made it difficult for future generations to fully understand the scale of the violence and the suffering that took place. This erasure has hindered healing for the survivors and has kept the memory of their pain buried. The absence of accountability has made it even harder for the survivors to find peace. They have been denied the opportunity to be heard and to have their suffering acknowledged. Despite this, many of their descendants are determined to keep their stories alive, pushing for justice and recognition of the crimes committed against their families. The fight for justice remains crucial, as it is not only about providing closure for the victims, but also about ensuring that such atrocities are never repeated. The survivors' voices must be heard, and their stories must be remembered to prevent history from repeating itself. The continued lack of justice for the atrocities committed during the Moroccan night has left deep emotional scars for the survivors. They continue to carry the trauma of the violence they endured, and the absence of an official apology or compensation has compounded their suffering. The failure of the French government to take responsibility for the crimes has left the survivors feeling neglected and abandoned, without any sense of closure. The fight for justice is not just about seeking financial compensation, but also about restoring the dignity of the victims. Survivors and their families want acknowledgement of the horrors they faced and the pain they continue to carry. Their fight is a quest for recognition, for their suffering to be officially acknowledged and remembered by the world. Despite the silence from the French government, many descendants of the survivors continue to advocate for justice. They push to keep the memory of the atrocities alive, determined that future generations understand the full scope of the suffering that took place. Their efforts aim to ensure that these dark chapters in history are not forgotten. The struggle for justice is not just for the survivors, but for all future generations. It is a call to prevent such violence from happening again and to ensure that the lessons of the past are learned. Only by holding the perpetrators accountable can true healing begin for those affected by the horrors of Monte Cassino.